All right, I have been tasked with, again, a somewhat arduous task of going over the dictatorship of the proletariat. So again, I've been asked to speak to you about the dictatorship of the proletariat, and in order, I'll first cover the general theoretical conception of dictatorship as commissarial dictatorship, sovereign dictatorship, and the state of exception as theorized by Giorgio Agamben. Next, I'll illustrate this with my usual example of the capitalist dictatorship. Then I'll move to the Marxist understanding of the dictatorship of the proletariat, covering Marx's general conception, Lenin's theory of class suppression, and later the withering of the state, and Mao's notion of dictatorship and democracy. Finally, I'll deal with Bakunin's criticisms of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then I'll get deeply into Lenin's notion of the withering of the state. So Giorgio Agamben provided a framework for examining dictatorship that falls into the categories of the commissarial dictatorship, the sovereign dictatorship, and the state of exception. Agamben sees the suspension of law as part of the essence of dictatorship. The suspension of law in order to protect the law itself is what's known as the commissarial dictatorship. This most commonly goes by the name of martial law. The Roman dictatorship best embodies this form of the commissarial dictatorship. One of the most famous Roman dictators was Lucius Quintinius Cincinnatus, after whom they named the city Cincinnati. The Roman Senate twice declared Cincinnatus dictator of Rome and temporarily suspended parts of the Constitution which granted Cincinnatus emergency powers, but not the power to change the Constitution itself. Upon the discharge of his duties, he returned the power to the Senate and went back into retirement. So this is the essence of the commissarial dictatorship, to immediately suspend the law, but for the sake of ultimately returning it. However, the sovereign dictatorship posing as the commissarial dictatorship remains far more common. The sovereign dictator not only suspends the law, but also exercises the ability to alter the law and to enforce a new law. One should understand Abraham Lincoln as a sovereign dictator posing as a commissarial dictator. Certainly he may have intended only to suspend the laws and the Constitution of the United States for the duration of the rebellion of the South. Nevertheless, he made himself a sovereign dictator when, through the Emancipation Declaration, he altered the laws to revoke the right of slavery. So again, posing as simply defending the Union, defending the Constitution, as a matter of fact, acted as a sovereign dictator because he did not simply suspend the laws, but also altered them. However, Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and the Soviets openly declared their sovereign dictatorship. They openly legislated as a ruling class against the capitalists, the monarchs, and anyone else who stood against the revolution. So again, this is sovereign dictatorship. It need not be clandestine, right? Like Napoleon, like Abraham Lincoln. It can be an openly declared dictatorship where one asserts that one has the ability to alter the constitutive laws of a society. The third theorized element is the state of exception. And this is the last, like I said, concept Agamben uses. It's not simply a suspension of the law or the power to alter or enforce the laws. It is the complete absence of law, which does not necessarily entail that the law is formally suspended. We can basically see this phenomena as two basically completely opposite phenomena. One is the Nazi regime. The other is a revolution itself. So in regards to the Nazi regime, their head of the Justice Department, the first one, was Franz Goethe, and he met with the Nazi leadership to protest their actions. Not necessarily because of their brutality, but because of their illegality. As a matter of fact, the Nazi regimes did not, although there were anti-Jewish laws, anti-communist laws, anti-social laws, as a matter of fact, most of the enforcement of these actions were not done with the jurisdiction of law. Franz Goethe should not be understood as a humanitarian. He didn't care that Jews were being killed, and neither did the later Schlickenberger. They didn't care that the Jews were being killed. They didn't care that gays were being tortured or gassed. What they cared about is it was against the law. And all they really wanted, and pleaded with the Nazi leadership, is to pass laws to make it legal. But this is an important distinction. It's not hyperbole to assert that the Nazis literally functioned as a criminal regime. Right? This is the Nazi state of exception, where the law is removed and the actions are themselves not really justified by anything, except conceptually for the Nazis. Of course, they justified it with the notion of Führerprinz, which is the Führer principle that Hitler should have supreme power invested in him, and everything followed from that. But that isn't, in fact, anything legal or lawful, right? So this sort of state of exception is no law at all. However, of course, this stands in complete contradistinction to the Soviet Union, where almost every action occurred with the force of law. In fact, it was the passing of the law and then the application of that law that almost universally led to anything that would later be called their crimes. If you have any questions about this, look at the Soviet gleaning law, colloquially known as the law of the spikes, which prevented people from pulling food out from collective farms for themselves and not accounting for it. And there were massive penalties of imprisonment, in some cases execution. And as a matter of fact, what happened is the law was too stringent, so the Soviet Union was constantly working to repeal laws and make them much more humane. But this is the sort of opposite mirror. The Nazis, or put rather, this is the difference between the sovereign dictatorship and the state of exception. The Nazis simply did whatever they want, and at their absolute best, made a law afterwards to justify it. The Soviets passed the law, right, as the sovereign dictators, and then it rigorously enforced that law. And so, again, the notion of dictatorship has to do with law, not necessarily in a narrow legal sense, but as the legislative ability of a society. A revolution also exists as a state of exception, right? No law or sovereign exists during a revolution until either the formalization of a new revolutionary society, most notably under a sovereign dictatorship, right? Or you have the return of the old law in the form of a counter-revolution. So these are the theoretical devices of dictatorship and how we should sort of understand our perspectives on dictatorship. So moving on. The sovereign is the form of dictator. It need not be an actual person or group of individuals, but simply that entity that holds the supreme power of decision. And this is, of course, the example that I often use. In Iran, they have free elections. One can vote for whichever candidate one wishes, and the votes are counted, and the votes are secret. However, there's one caveat. All candidates must first gain approval by the Guardian Council. And of course, the Guardian Council is a bunch of learned Islamic scholars, along with various officials. And so, even though there's a free election, this Guardian Council effectively rules as a dictatorship of Iran. However, we shouldn't be too smug towards our Iranian counterparts. In the United States, any candidate must either fall ideologically in line with the two major parties, which do little but support corporate capitalist interests, and of course the parties support capitalist interests because of the massive donations that come from corporate capitalism. So it's not unreasonable for them to do this, even if it's immoral. Or they must themselves have enough wealth or corporate sponsorship to run independently. A good example of this would be Ross Perot, who is independently wealthy, and so in this way he's able to break out of the conditions of corporate capitalism only because he himself embodies corporate capitalism. And so, it's not necessarily all that much better. But in either case, money rules our system from top to bottom. And so we, of course, live in what Marxists would, I believe, quite rightfully declare a capitalist dictatorship. Because just like the Iranians have free elections, we also have free elections. And who decides who can run in our elections? Money. And what is the class to which money belongs? The capitalist class. An alternative example to both of these, of course, would be Cuba. In Cuba, everyone elects local neighborhood officials, and through these local neighborhood officials, they then elect every other office. Now, it's important to note all parties, and that's including the Communist Party, are unable to publicly campaign. And they must win elections through word-of-mouth campaigns and support of their neighbors. And so, again, these neighborhood representatives elect either directly or indirectly every level above them. They elect, I believe, it's the Constitutive Assembly or the Assembly of the Revolution, and then that assembly elects the president and the speaker, who would be, in this case, Raul Castro. So, in any case, they lack freedom of speech that we have. I mean, if you have any questions about that, just look at the recent Supreme Court ruling. It's not a distortion for the Supreme Court to rule that, as a matter of fact, money is freedom of speech, and that corporations should have unlimited freedom of speech, right? This makes perfect sense because who ultimately decides? It's a capitalist dictatorship. And it's not hyperbole to say, right, that in Cuba, where you have essentially a lack of ability of freedom to campaign in a certain way, you have to do it completely word of mouth, you're unable to spend money, this serves as a dictatorship against the capitalists and in favor of the workers. And the dictatorship of the workers of Cuba, again, completely undercuts any capitalists who would want to use money to alter things, which is a restriction of that capitalist's freedom. And so, of course, the upshot of all this is the point is that for every society, regardless of its apparent forms, it's a dictatorship of some variety. And the question then becomes a dictatorship of whom? And this leads us right to Marx. From this general knowledge of dictatorship, we'll move to the Marxist analysis. And of course, Marx documented two key features in understanding the capitalist dictatorship. Most have noticed the first, which is under capitalism, the laws of capitalist society, surprise, surprise, serve the capitalists. He points this out in the 18th of Brumaire in a discussion of the French Constitution in the mid-19th century. He said, "The Constitution, therefore, constantly refers to future organic laws which are to put into effect those marginal notes and regulate the enjoyment of these unrestricted liberties in such a manner that they will collide neither with one another or with public safety." And later, these organic laws were brought into being by friends of order, and all those liberties regulated in such a manner that the bourgeoisie, in its enjoyment of them, finds itself unhindered by the equal rights of other classes. Where it forbids these liberties entirely to, quote, the others, or permits enjoyment of them under the condition that they are so many police traps. This always happens solely in the interest of quote-unquote public safety, that is to say, the safety of the bourgeois, as the Constitution prescribes. And you'll notice, again, we see this most clearly with George W. Bush recently, but you can find it in every law. Any law that would pass, he would write in a signing statement. And it's the signing statements that are the real essence of the law, it's the marginal notes. It's the apparently unintended consequences that secure the capitalist position in our society. In any case, this insight is quite common, and pretty much everyone can easily recognize it. As Anatole France says, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. Reformists, of course, see this as a call to change the laws into something more equitable. Marx's second insight really renders this course of action completely pointless. It's not that the capitalists conspiratorially pull strings behind the scenes, but the very form of democracy itself allows for the competing interests of the bourgeoisie, that is to say, right, the capitalists, to manifest themselves directly in a way that monarchy or a form of pure dictatorship would not. Once again, the 18th of Brumaire, he states, They do their real business as the party of order. That was one of the French parties for the restoration of order, which meant the king. But he said, they do their real business in the party of order, that is, under a social, not a political title, as representatives of the bourgeois world order, not as knights of errant princesses, as the bourgeois class against other classes, not as royalists against republicans. And as the party of order, they exercise more unrestricted and sterner domination over other classes in society than previously under any other form, or previously under the Restoration or the July Monarchy, a domination which in general was possible only under the form of a parliamentary republic. For only under this form could the two great divisions of the French bourgeoisie unite, and thus put their rule as a class of instead of the regime of a privileged faction of to make it the order of the day. So again, we should understand the competing political parties not as right-wing or left-wing, not as big government or small government, but rather as competing factions of one capitalist agenda against another capitalist agenda. If George W. Bush invades Iraq, he does so under the capitalist agenda that it will bring money to the capitalists as a class. If Barack Obama wants to withdraw from Iraq, he does it not out of any humanitarian sentiments, but because he and the Democrats believe that pulling out of Iraq will entail more profits for the bourgeois, the capitalists, as a class. So, in any case, the dictatorship of the proletariat stands opposed to this capitalist dictatorship. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a transitional period used to ensure the dominance of the proletariat, or workers, over the bourgeoisie, right, the capitalists. However, he warns against attempting to imagine what the dictatorship of the proletariat will look like beforehand. He writes, the question then arises, what transformation will the state undergo in a communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to present state functions? This question can only be answered scientifically, and one does not get a flea hop nearer to the problem by a thousand-fold combination of the words people and the word state. Between capitalist and communist society, there lies a period of revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this, it is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing more than the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. This advocates the general form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the specific form that it would necessarily take would come later through the experiences of revolutionary history. Lenin, of course, added to the theory and practice of the dictatorship of the proletariat through the recognition of its suppressive nature and his call for its withering, and the withering will be more dealt with at the end of the lecture. Lenin rejects the liberal notion that the state helps mediate conflicts. He writes, according to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of, quote, order, which legislates and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. In the opinion of every petty bourgeois politician, however, order means the reconciliation of classes and not the oppression of one class by another. To alleviate the conflict means reconciling the classes, not to deprive the oppressed classes of definite means and methods of struggle to overthrow the oppressors. The dictatorship of the proletariat then entails replacing the bourgeois or capitalist forms of suppression of the workers with proletarian or worker forms of suppression of the capitalists. Lenin spells out explicitly what this would mean. It is impossible because civilized society is split into antagonistic and moreover irreconcilably antagonistic classes whose, quote, self-acting arming would lead to an armed struggle between them. A state arises, a special power is created, special bodies of armed men, and every revolution by destroying the state apparatus shows us the naked class struggle. It clearly shows us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving the exploited instead of the exploiters. This formulation of the dictatorship of the proletariat became one of the most successful modes for the revolutionary struggle, but even it remains incomplete. Mao forms the last revolutionary theorization of the dictatorship of the proletariat based upon concrete revolutionary struggles, and while following Lenin, also explores the concept of democracy in regards to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Again, Mao follows Lenin in his general conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In On the Correct Handling of Contradiction Among the People, he writes, "Our state is a people's democratic dictatorship led by the working class and based on the worker-peasant alliance. What is this dictatorship for? Its first function is to suppress reactionary classes and elements and those exploiters in our country who resist the socialist revolution, to suppress those who try to wreck our socialist society or socialist construction, and in other words, to resolve the internal contradictions between ourselves and the enemy. For instance, to arrest, try, and sentence certain counter-revolutionaries, and to deprive landlords and bureaucrat capitalists of their right to vote and their freedom of speech for a specified period of time. All this comes within the scope of our dictatorship. To maintain public order and safeguard the interests of the people is likewise necessary to exercise the dictatorship over embezzlers, swindlers, arsonists, murderers, criminal gangs, and other scoundrels who seriously disrupt public order." So that's the first function. The second function of this dictatorship is to protect our country from subversion and the possible aggression by external enemies. In that event, it is the task of the dictatorship to resolve the external contradictions between the enemy and us. The aim of this dictatorship is to protect all our people so they can devote themselves to peaceful labor and build China into a socialist country with a modern industry, agriculture, science, and culture. This serves as a specification, but not an advance over Lenin's formulation. Mao theorizes the proper inversion of Marx's insight that all democracies are dictatorships. He realizes in theory and in practice this dictatorship must also generate a new sort of democracy. He argues, and I quote, "The people's democratic dictatorship uses two methods. Towards its enemy, it uses the method of dictatorship. That is, for as long a period of time as necessary, it does not let them take part in political activities and compels them to obey the laws of the people's government and to engage in labor, and through labor to transform themselves into new men. Towards the people, on the contrary, it uses the method not of compulsion, but of democracy. That is, it must necessarily let them take part in political activities and does not compel them to do this or that, but uses the method of democracy in educating and persuading them." In this way, the notion of dictatorship has come full circle. Marx found dictatorship in democracy. Mao found democracy in dictatorship. However, one could not complete the discussion of dictatorship of the proletariat without mentioning anarchist objections. Bakunin's Marxism, Freedom, and the State offers objections of the necessary imperialism of the state, its suppression of some of its members, its alienating effects, and its social elites. Bakunin characterizes Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat as calling for a strong pan-German state to be ruled by Marx himself as the dictator. This has no basis in reality, but he did also provide some substantial theoretical objections to which we will deal. The first objection of Bakunin that Bakunin raises is that the state must necessarily become imperialist. He writes, "Any state under pain of perishing and seeing itself devoured by its neighboring state must tend towards complete power, and having become powerful it must embark on a career of conquests so that it shall not itself be conquered. For two powers similar and at the same time foreign to each other could not coexist without trying to destroy each other. Whoever says conquest says conquered people, enslaved and in bondage under whatever form or name it may be." This sounds like quite a plausible objection on paper. However, it isn't necessarily entailed by the facts. Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia have not tried to conquer any of their neighbors. Even Robespierre stood against the spreading of revolution to other states during the revolutionary period. The revolution, because for him and most revolutionaries, the revolution inside the state, at least at the time, remains more important than the wasted efforts of attempting to force itself on other people, unwilling or unable to accept it. This distinction forms rather the core difference between socialism in one country and Trotsky's permanent revolution, which again attempts to install communism through military force. But again, there's no necessity of a state becoming imperialist. It's simply a danger, which is true of all states and all enterprises. So his next objection, he argues that the state must necessarily suppress some people within it. Bakunin argues the state is a government from above downwards of an immense number of men, very different from the point of view of the degree of their culture, the name of the countries or localities they inhabit, the occupation they follow, the interests and aspirations directing them. The state is the government of all these by some or other minority. This minority, even if it were 1,000 times elected by universal suffrage and controlled in its acts by popular institutions, unless it were endowed with omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, which the theologians attribute to God, it is impossible that it could know and foresee the needs or satisfy with even justice the most legitimate and pressing interests of the world. There will always be discontented people because there will always be some who are to be sacrificed. In this case, the Marxist would argue, he misses the point. Of course, people will be sacrificed. Those people are the capitalists. It is not acceptable. Bakunin quote in mind, because that's what I'm going to start talking about. Are we good to go?
Yeah.
Okay, Bakunin, abstraction, state will. Okay, first off, this contradicts his first point. Either the state must be a personal will of a privileged minority, or else it's an abstract entity which blunts all wills in the name of the general will. It can't be simultaneously both a personal will and an abstract general will. One or the other. They're, again, two mutually exclusive things. So let's for the moment assume that the state does blunt individual wills in the name of an abstract common good, right? A non-existent entity. To which we should reply, good. In the Soviet Union, the individual will was to gain profit from withholding food is replaced by the general will of feeding the cities. In China, the individual will of the privileged elites is to hold on to their status. It is replaced by the general will of ensuring the people have education, food, medicine, and an equal say. In Cuba, the individual will for status, prestige, and individual comfort at the expense of others is replaced by the general will of ensuring health, education, and the protection of one's friends and families and neighbors. In this case, I don't view Bakunin's objection as terribly sound or convincing. But of course, feel free to read the text yourself and make a judgment. But yes, as a matter of fact, the dictatorship of the proletariat is an abstract general will. And the abstract general will is the will of the proletariat as a class, again an abstraction, against the very real individual personal wills of the capitalists who wish to continue capitalist exploitation. So yes, I think Bakunin is absolutely right. It's an abstract general will. At the risk of being called Castro for speaking forever, let me touch on two final points. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a temporary feature of Marxism and must ultimately itself be abolished. And this is, again, Lenin. Only in a communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists has disappeared, when there are no classes, i.e., when there are no distinctions between the member of society in regards to their relation of the social means of production, only then, quote, the state ceases to exist, unquote, and, quote, it becomes possible to speak of freedom, unquote. Only then will a truly complete democracy become possible and realized, a democracy without any exception whatever. And only then will democracy begin to wither away owing to the simple fact that freed from capitalist slavery and the horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without subordination, without any special apparatus of coercion that is called the state. Here we can see that Lenin sets a limit for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Once capitalism has been abolished and its pernicious influences removed from humanity, the dictatorship of the proletariat will be abolished as well. However, people must become more humane, that the state will become less and less necessary, and hence its withering. And again, they don't need to be angels, but we need to abolish the possibility of capitalist exploitation. Some Marxists, especially revisionists, will reject the concretely existing forms of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They will claim Marx used it as a metaphor that would bear no resemblance to the actual policies of the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Cuba, and any other communist regimes. Nevertheless, we should not be too abstract or otherwise deceived. We must follow Engels, who in 1891, postscript to Marx' The Civil War in France, said, "Of late, the social democratic Philistines has once more been filled with the wholesome terror at the words, dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, good gentlemen, do you want to know what the dictatorship of the proletariat looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. To this we should add, and the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China, and Cuba, and Venezuela, and all other revolutionary beacons, however darkened, which stand as a light and a guide to the people." Thank you. I always feel, if you'll pardon the term, somewhat dictatorial about stifling the conversations that I've started. So let's start. Any questions, objections? Brett?
We're wondering, at least our group was wondering if you could give some historical examples of when the USSR accurately represented the proletariat and when they did not.
Sure. Starts in October Revolution. Well, yeah, October Revolution is when you're dealing with the USSR. You had the February Revolution, which installed a provisional government, which was a bourgeois capitalist government. It continued the war that everybody hated. The Bolsheviks tried to seize power in July. They were not treated too friendly after that. But then the whites were coming in to essentially disband the provisional government and install either a aristocratic dictatorship or the Tsar proper. And so Lenin and the Bolsheviks were returned armed to fight off the whites. They conveniently did not return their weapons, and they seized the government again, or tried to seize successfully the government in the October Revolution. Now, there was the Soviets, which were workers' councils, and then there was the Constitutive Assembly, which was sort of like their parliament. Lenin said all power to the Soviets. The Soviets, in a certain sense, were non-democratic institutions. They were made up of concrete individual groups of workers, concrete individual groups of soldiers. Aristocrats were not allowed. Basically, intelligentsia, I don't believe, had their own Soviets. Peasants, as a matter of fact, didn't make or weren't part of a lot of Soviets unless they were soldiers' Soviets. And so in this case, you have a dictatorship of the proletariat in its literal sense. You also have this huge time of crisis in the Civil War. Most orthodox Marxist-Leninists, especially who are kind of touchy about Stalin, will say when Lenin dies, that's when you have, right, the bureaucrats move in. I would go up to at least, I would go up to at least the end of World War II. In this case, you have Stalin. It's not a pure dictatorship of the proletariat. Because in the 30s, what happens is you get bureaucratic classes that are trying to basically secure their power. And it's really interesting. I have a friend of mine who does research on Soviet foreign policy, but also does work with the Soviet Union graduate level. And he was telling me about Stalin's constitution. Now, you can view it as self-serving, but Stalin actually wanted to institute more radical democracy through his constitution. Because at the time, candidates had to be selected or at least approved by local party officials. And this caused a lot of resentment among the people, right? This would be why it's not a complete dictatorship of the proletariat. But he was trying to force through universal suffrage and the ability for anyone to run, because he reasoned that the people would then replace these corrupt bureaucrats who were trying to carve out their own fiefdoms. So what's the upshot of this? Well, the terror, the Great Terror, that comes about in 1939 is actually based, I mean, it has a lot of factors, but it comes from the bottom, right? So as late as 39, you have workers and you have peasants reporting corrupt party officials, and thus the party officials being purged. Sometimes this meant work, sometimes this meant loss of position, sometimes this meant a very heavy case of lead poisoning. So, so yeah, I mean, as late as 39, you have a bottom-up purge that, right, I mean, it's often characterized as Stalin being this evil monster fighting his enemies, but most of the purges came from the bottom, because he said, look, if you're dissatisfied or you know corrupt bureaucrats who are wreckers and saboteurs, report them. And of course, all the people who had been suppressed by lower party officials report everyone above them. And so this is why you basically have everyone purged. So even the Terror of 39 I would see as an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. After World War II, Stalin attempts to stabilize the Soviet Union because it's, you know, undergone a civil war and modernization and World War II, and he begins to attenuate his position to the West. What date it is, I wouldn't know, but I'm not a hardline anti-revisionist who blames Khrushchev, evil bad Khrushchev, for undoing everything Stalin did. I think that Stalin was moving towards revisionism, and so I would say late in Stalin's governance of the Soviet Union is when we see revision and when we see the loss of the dictatorship of the proletariat and its replacement with the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie that goes by the name of the bureaucratic class.
Awesome.
Does that answer?
Do we want to go around? We had more questions.
Well, let's just go hands, and if nobody else has hands, I'll go to the next one. But Josh, you got a question for me.
Yeah, it's about the Paris Commune, and of course the Paris Commune is something that both Marxists and anarchists can get on board with. But I was wondering in what way the actual political organization of during the Paris Commune resembles, say, Bolshevik Russia or China or
very little. The organization of the Paris Commune most accurately resembles a mess. And this is a big chunk of the, I mean, not in any way to denigrate.
I mean this in response to Engels' endorsement of the Paris Commune as the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Oh, well, in this case, Engels, I mean, if you read State and Revolution, there's big, huge chunk block quotes of Engels. Engels, a little background on the Paris Commune, and I mentioned this to you guys, but I'll mention to you. If you want to know about the Paris Commune, Marx's On the Civil War in France. Great place to go. So if you're interested about that history, check it out. It's not too big. Basically what happens is you have the Paris Communards. You have Paris loses a war to Prussia. Prussia besieges Paris. Weird deal brokering going on. Paris remains independent, right? Okay, so what happens is the dictator, who I believe at this point is I forget his first name. It's Napoleon III. And so basically, he wants Paris to basically foot the bill because Paris is one of the main industrial cities. They say no. They form a new provisional revolutionary government in Paris. At this point, the Prussians, or I believe they're Germans at this point, are just like, we don't want to mess with this. Because they're granted a little piece of Paris, which is to say a park, a couple parks, and you have armed communards basically keeping them out. Because the communards, unlike the French armies and other French units, did not turn over their weapons. So anyway, they start this up. They ask politely the banks to turn over some funds, and they start, moderately co-opting stuff, and they basically stay put. Now, Tulare, if I remember correctly, is the capital, just a little ways away. They're like, what are we going to do? Paris, and of course, right, the communards do nothing. So Tulare scrambles and begs the Germans to literally turn over the armies that the Germans have captured so that they can put down the Paris Commune. And of course, they're willing to pay 5 million, I believe it's 5 million francs to do it. So the Germans are like, yeah, we'll give you back your army to kill a bunch of communists we don't like for 5 million francs. So what happens is these incredibly liberated, revolutionaries who man barricades and, start working in their own factories and are working to, compensate capitalists for things that they steal and, all that sort of thing. Long story short, they're put down. And they're put down hard. And so for Engels, as for Lenin, as for most Marxists, what they learn is you should not expect any mercy from capitalists. You should not restrain yourself when you are fighting a revolution. And so for Engels, obviously I'm a Marxist-Leninist Maoist, so I'm going to have a really strong read of Engels. But you'll notice orthodox, quote-unquote orthodox Marxists, they don't deal with Engels. They don't deal with dialectical materialism. They don't deal with his commentaries. They don't deal with his works on the state. And the reason why is because Engels learned this lesson as well, which is when you're fighting a revolution, you do what you have to do. And so, right, when he points to the Paris Commune, he says, look, armed people rising up, grabbing onto stuff and defending themselves. That's what the dictatorship of the proletariat looks like. And so, I view Lenin as consistent with Marx and Engels and what they declare as the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, does that answer?
Can I add something? According to everything that I've read and direct testimonies, Paris was run well. Factories ran well. The city went great. The problem was no ability to defend against somebody like basically Versailles or the Germans. No ability to defend itself and prevent, in order to allow itself to continue.
Could this be because it's one isolated city, besieged by armies? Not necessarily.
Actually, no. No, you should actually look at the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution began as a single city, St. Petersburg. The St. Petersburg Soviet was the single most important Soviet, and really, although there was discontent everywhere, it was the site of revolutionary activity. This is something, and I'm not blaming you with this, but this is something 20th century communists or Marxists or leftists have forgotten, is the notion of a revolutionary city. It wasn't until, late in the game means months, but literally St. Petersburg was alone as a revolutionary power against the Constitutive Assembly, against the whites, against the foreign powers. And unlike the Paris Commune, they were willing to march and organize on Moscow. And then you had two cities. And they were willing to expand. This is the thing that most people don't realize. If the Paris Commune would have turned those militias into even a moderately well-regulated army and marched on Tulare, or you say Versailles, but I believe it was Tulare. Isn't that how you pronounce it?
Tulare city?
Yeah, the city. Because Versailles was the...
Tuileries.
Oh,
yeah, that's...
I don't know. I'm not French.
No, that's right in the middle of Paris. Tuileries. There might have been some... That's also where the king's palace is.
Yeah, I don't remember...
So there might have been most, but when the armies came, there would have been no way for... They came from Versailles.
Oh, okay. Well, because that's where Napoleon III ended. It's a big, confusing mess. But there was, I believe, there was a month, right? Because the Paris Commune lasted about 2 months. There was a month, at least a couple weeks, in which the French armies were held captive in Germany. And the Germans were holding themselves back against the communards. And even a makeshift army, like the Red Guards in Russia, could have marched on the capital, dispelled the constitutive, or I believe at this point it's the National Assembly. They keep changing. Dispelled the National Assembly, instituted a new National Assembly, deposed Napoleon III, and essentially made a new government. So
they were very civil towards Napoleon III and the Germans.
Yeah, and so,
Asking for money back, they gave it back to them, stuff like that.
yeah, and so again, I mean, not to be overly critical, but historically, it doesn't have anything to do with being a single city. They, as a matter of fact, could have done this. And not only that, when it happened again, you had a revolutionary city like the Paris Commune, which was St. Petersburg. They took advantage. They did not let any opportunity pass by, and they did everything they could to secure the revolution. So, does that?
Yes.
Okay. And if you research more, we can always talk about it. Additional questions, comments? You said you had more.
Nate?
Yeah.
I believe mentioned something about the Republic of China suppressing trade unions, and we're wondering, is that true? And in your opinion, do you think that accurately represents the proletariat?
Most trade union suppression, for example, Tiananmen Square, big trade unionist suppression. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble because this is going online, and the other anti-revisionists are not going to like me talking about this. But I don't view anything after Mao as anything but restored capitalism, state capitalism. Is it better as a system than pure-on capitalism? Yes. So I will not support the invasion of the People's Republic of China or anything like that. But does it accurately represent the dictatorship of the proletariat? Absolutely not. For me personally, the dictatorship of the proletariat in China ends when Mao disbands the Shanghai Commune. He declared the Cultural Revolution, worker control, self-management. The international situation became tense over the border of the Soviet Union. Mao chose to disband the Chinese Commune, or Shanghai Commune, because Shanghai was one of the main industrial cities. He believed that he would need it for the upcoming war with the Soviets. That was a bad choice. I think that's the moment, or at least the beginning of the end for the dictatorship of the proletariat. But any other time before that, if there was any suppression of trade unions, I would have to look at the actual instance, but I would almost certainly support it, because many times before that, there were very few industrial centers, and very few of them were unionized. So oftentimes, unions in these incredibly reactionary not always, but a lot of times, unions in these incredibly reactionary countries actually serve a privileged elite. If you want to look at bad unions, look historically at the AFL-CIO, the AFL. This was before they merged with the CIO, so I don't want to slander the CIO. But look at the AFL, especially under Samuel Gompers. And he was a craft unionist, and the unions would exclude women, blacks, Chinese, even poorer white workers who didn't have high-paying jobs. So I would need to see the exact trade unions, but anything after 69, I would write off as revisionism and a betrayal of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Do you have specificities or?
No, just...
Okay.
What's revisionism?
Revisionism is where you revise the principles of Marxist-Leninism, or Marxism/Marxist-Leninism, Marxist-Leninist from universal communism and the dictatorship of the proletariat and the domination of the capitalists by the proletariat to just a social system where people are taken care of a little bit better. And so you have revised principles of universal justice, of universal class struggle, into just, kind of mediating things, making sure people are doing all right. And so that's the revise, and I'm against that.
Gotcha.
Yes, Paul.
All right, so you mentioned two people, Stalin and Mao, both, and you said that both of them, after them or whatever, or during their time, the dictatorship of the proletariat went to something else. It went to the dictatorship of
usually
capitalist class or bourgeois class or bureaucratic class, but it went to a dictatorship of something else.
Yes.
So a dictatorship of the proletariat went to a dictatorship still.
Yep.
So if we take away the dictatorship of the proletariat, and we just have the people rise up without the dictatorship, isn't that better?
No. Look at the Paris Commune. Look at Spain. Look at the Zapatistas. No, when people rise up without a dictatorship, without special armed bodies of men prepared to defend them, at very best, the Zapatistas did the best job of it, of having this uprising. And they basically depend always on strong international support and strong Human Rights Watch to put pressure, specifically American pressure, on the government of Mexico to not go in and wipe them out. But no, at least for me, I mean, obviously everyone's going to have a different opinion, but if you have a strong uprising without a concrete plan for